Noon. My name is David Luberoff. I'm the Joint Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk about Black homeowners, white homesteaders, and failed gentrification in Detroit. Before I introduce today's speakers, I just want to let you know about two upcoming events which will wrap up our fall speaker series. On Tuesday, November 18th at 4 o'clock, the Joint Center and the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston are co-sponsoring an online panel discussion focused on the state of affordable housing finance. Speakers will include Marketia from Mass Housing, Sunshine Mathan from the Piedmont Housing Alliance, and Chris Herbert from the Joint Center for Housing Studies. It'll be moderated by Samya Mishra, a former Rappaport Public Finance Fellow. 2 days later, on Thursday, November 21st at 3:15 at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Joint Center, Harvard's Institute of Politics, and the Initiative on Health and Homelessness at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health will be co-sponsoring a talk by Denver Mayor Mike Johnston, who'll be discussing his city's notable efforts to address the problem of unsheltered homelessness. That will be in person only and open only to Harvard students and Harvard affiliates. More information about that, other events as we start scheduling them for the spring is available on our website and of course through our weekly emails. Now on to today's event. We're thrilled to welcome back Sharon Cornelissen, a former Joint Center Postdoctoral Fellow, who's now the Director of Housing at the Consumer Federation of America. Sharon's going to be talking about her new book, Last House on the Block, Black Homeowners, White Homesteaders, and Failed Gentrification in Detroit. A deep ethnographic dive into Detroit's Broadmoor neighborhood. I'll let her tell you more about it in a minute. After Sharon will talk for about 30 minutes. After her remarks, we'll hear brief comments from Tony Griffin, a professor of practice in urban planning at the Graduate School of Design, where she also heads the Just City Lab and the Just City Mayoral Fellowship Program. Tony, I think, is uniquely qualified to comment on Sharon's work. Trained as an architect, she's worked as an official or a consultant in a host of cities, including Detroit, where she was the project director for a 2-year project that in 2012 resulted in the publication of the Detroit Strategic Framework, a 50-year vision for the city's future that brought together reflections of apparently over 100,000 people. I'll then moderate a conversation with Sharon and Tony. I'll be drawing on questions that I hope you submit through Zoom's Q&A feature. Apologies in advance if we don't get to all of your questions. The conversation will end at about 1:15 p.m. A video of the event and a copy of Sharon's slides will be posted on the Joint Center's website by early next week. Sharon, welcome back. It's all yours.
There we go. Thank you so much, David. Let me share my screen. There we go. Yes, it's so special to be back at the Harvard Joint Center because I wrote most of the actual book while a postdoc at the Joint Center. So I really appreciate that. And I'm really excited to be engaged with Professor Tony Griffin as well. So thank you. So I'll just give you a little preview of the book. 30 minutes is pretty difficult for an ethnography, but I'll do my best. So this book started when I was a graduate student in sociology at Princeton University. And while I was there, I knew I wanted to do an ethnography, like an in-depth study of one community where I would live in a community for a couple of years. Hello. But when I was there, I didn't know yet where this would be. And as I was thinking about it, Detroit was actually in the news a lot. So this was in 2014. And Detroit was going through its historical bankruptcy at the time, the largest municipal bankruptcy in US history. And as a result, it was capturing national and international headlines. But most stories written this way by journalists like represented one or two representations. On the one hand, there was this enduring representation of Detroit as murder capital, and it was portrayed as this place where almost everyone had left. Pictures showed the unpeopled remains in the city. And, a lot of these representations were, implicitly coded as Black or racialized too, even though 700,000 people still called the city home. On the other hand, this newer representation emerged around this time about Detroit as the most exciting place in America, as the place to be, or perhaps the next stop on the L train. This representation was coded as white, and somehow all the newcomers seemed to be either Brooklyn millennials or Michigan billionaires, sort of coming to grace the city with their presence and save it through their new presence. This representation even came to my own neighborhood. I was living in South Williamsburg at the time in Brooklyn, and billboards about Detroit appeared in my own neighborhood. For example, this billboard on the left kind of referenced this representation that Detroit would be like the next stop on the L train, right? That Brooklyn gentrifiers tired of rising rents would move there next. And then the picture on the right kind of references this representation of Detroit as somehow empty and having, space for whomever wants to move there. I thought there was more to the story, and I thought there was a real room here to tell an actual story of what was happening in Detroit from the perspective of one of its neighborhoods. And I was really curious in the sort of everyday experiences of both longtime Detroiters, but also newcomers that were moving there, and what it was like for them to live in one of the neighborhoods and a place far away from downtown where so much media attention was going. So to do that, I decided, I want to write this book. So I moved to Detroit. And I ended up living in a Brightmoor neighborhood for 3 years from 2015 to 2018. So the Brightmoor neighborhood is located in Northwest Detroit. It is about a 20-minute drive on the highway to downtown, so not that close to downtown. And I did my ethnography there for 3 years. So what is ethnography, or what was I doing there? I met hundreds of Detroiters while I lived there, and just kind of lived my everyday life in Brightmoor, and really tried to meet as many people as I could and really understand residents' perspectives and stories. I would hang out at the farmers market. I grew my own garden. I would go to many of the churches in the neighborhood. I would eat at the soup kitchen. I would bike around the neighborhood, drive with people around the neighborhood, and just kind of hang out with a lot of people to get to know them and the neighborhood. After 1 year of living in Brightmoor, I became a homeowner. I even bought my own house in Brightmoor. Um, and the process of buying a house was very different than what we normally think about when we think about homeownership and housing markets. There was no real estate agent, no appraiser, no attorney part of our closing. I bought the house without a mortgage because banks don't lend mortgages that small. So I bought it in cash for $7,000. And I typed out the deed myself. And our closing paperwork was only one page, like the deed that I typed out myself, which is very different from how normally home closings go. The reason that housing was so cheap in Brightmoor was not only because of a long history of decline and depopulation, but also because the neighborhood was really hit hard by the subprime mortgage foreclosure crisis in the 2000s, where lenders targeted Black neighborhoods in particular, such as Brightmoor, to sell their predatory and exploitative products. So a lot of people lost their home already in the 2000s or went through bankruptcy. And by the time I moved there in 2015, a new crisis was hitting Detroit, which was the tax foreclosure crisis. So again, tens of thousands of Detroiters lost their home during this time because they had fallen behind. They fell behind on taxes. Um, Even as property values had gone down, the city had overassessed many of these homes. And as people fell behind, they faced steep fines and fees. And as the county foreclosed on these homes, it started selling them starting at $500. So even though my own house for $7,000 was not a foreclosure, myself and other newcomers moving into this neighborhood, still, our bargains were still structured by these losses that were happening all around the neighborhood. However, homeownership did give me a unique perspective on the neighborhood and brought me even closer to a lot of residents and understanding their experiences. So what is Brightmoor like? I mean, to understand, like, I'd urge you to read the book. That's why I wrote the book. But one way of looking at that is through the numbers. We're at the Harvard Joint Center after all. So one way, to look at that is through numbers. So Brightmoor faced steep depopulation over the last more than 50 years by now. And lost more than 60% of its population in during that time. As the neighborhood depopulated, it also racially transitioned from 99% white to a majority black neighborhood. The neighborhood saw a lot of poverty. So a lot of both renters and homeowners in Brightmoor struggled to stay housed and faced both eviction and foreclosures. Vacant housing really surged during this time. So by the time I moved into Brightmoor, every other property had become a vacant lot, and every third home that still remained standing had become empty. So immense abandonment that had happened in this neighborhood. Something surprising happened though in Brightmoor starting in 2006. This neighborhood that had lost population decade after decade, all of a sudden saw the influx of a group of white newcomers who were attracted to move into Brightmoor, partly because of its deeply affordable property, but especially because they could start gardens and farms on its many vacant lots. So I call these newcomers the urban farmers in my book. And they were kind of the newest residents moving into Brightmoor. So what's the argument of the book, right? What's the book about? So when we think about cities, we may have, these kinds of images in mind, right? When we think about urbanism and cities and gentrification, the pictures that spring to mind are these densely populated cities where, they're very walkable. There's a lot of apartment buildings. There's a lot of renters. There's public transportation. There's mixed uses. So there's restaurants and residents kind of all on the same block. And that's what we usually think of when we think about urban neighborhoods. But there's another type of urbanism that is still very widespread and that we haven't paid enough attention to. And that's the urbanism of depopulated cities. And Detroit is not unique here. There's a lot of cities that have historically gone through depopulation and that are still struggling with decline and depopulation. Other examples include Baltimore, parts of Chicago, Memphis, Birmingham, Trenton, Fall River in Massachusetts. Even Boston and New York City have had their own history of decline in the 70s and the 80s. There was a study, Brookings study on declining cities in the 80s, and it ranked Boston even below Newark and Detroit on measures of decline, right? So while cities like New York City and Boston have mostly recovered because of the influx of new jobs and industries and immigration and gentrification, a lot of other cities are still struggling with the legacies of decline and are still depopulating. So in my book, for example, I show the cities that depopulated between 2000 and 2020. So the cities labeled on this map are all cities that lost at least 10% of their population during these 2 decades. And you see that many of them are mid-sized to smaller cities that we may not, they may not be as flashy as New York City, but they're cities nonetheless. And it's mostly in the sort of industrial, post-industrial Midwest and in the South, former agricultural hubs in the South that have seen depopulation. These cities are also much more likely to have Black residents, so the experience of urban depopulation is much more common among Black Americans. And as such, depopulation is also an underappreciated aspect of racial inequality, right? We often talk about gentrification as shaping racial inequality, but depopulation is very much still part of the experience as well and is shaping racial disparities. So there's 2 key questions that I answer in my book. First, what is it like? What is everyday life like in an extremely depopulated urban neighborhood, right? What's this other urbanism look like for residents? So this includes questions of like, what is it like to live in the last house on the block? What kind of futures are people imagining in a place like Brightmoor? How do people deal with safety and violence in a place that has so few homes left on the block? And what's the experience of home ownership like in a place where, homes sell at the time sold for $10,000 or less? And then second, what does gentrification look like in such a place, right? Why did the white newcomers decide to move into Brightmoor? This is a place where, thousands of residents before them have left, right? Like it's a place that people are leaving, not moving into generally. So why this place? And how does gentrification look different under these extreme circumstances, right? In a place where the amenities include vacant lots rather than public transportation, for example. A place that has no supermarkets, let alone a Whole Foods. And then also, how, how did gentrification feel in this place, right? Why didn't it kind of continue on after these early white newcomers moved in? So to step back, this kind of question, what is gentrification even? I think everyone has an opinion about gentrification. It's a highly moralized idea. Even academics are still debating what gentrification actually is, and they're disagreeing with each other, like about the causes and the consequences of gentrification. But in my book, I try to keep it simple. I said, well, this is how I define gentrification. And it's this process of neighborhood upscaling that starts when higher income residents move into a previously lower income community. And famous examples of gentrification include Wicker Park, for example, in Chicago, and Soho in New York City. Cases like Wicker Park and Soho also demonstrate that gentrification is not the opposite of urban decline, but in fact, these things often go together, right? So urban decline is often a predecessor to gentrification, as both newcomers and then also investors that follow kind of repurpose empty vacated spaces and see profitability potential in communities that have previously been devalued. It happens in waves. So gentrification doesn't all happen all at once. There's often different generations of newcomers, and the first newcomers are often artists or students, like people that may be culturally middle class, but also have lower incomes themselves. And then they're often followed by higher income newcomers. So there's these waves that happen. And after the first generation or two of newcomers come in, we often see gentrification be turbocharged by top-down investments. And this can be investments both from the city as they're deciding to improve services, for example, or start parks or rezone or give tax breaks to developers, as well as investments by home buyers in businesses kind of coming in and seeing opportunity here in upscaling this neighborhood, but in the process driving up both property taxes and rents, which in turn can displace longtime residents and longtime businesses as well. Gentrification is often associated with racial displacement. It's often seen as sort of a synonym for racial displacement. But it is possible, right? We see cases where white newcomers move into a predominantly black or brown neighborhood, but it's not necessary. It's not the same, right? We actually, if you look at cities where gentrification has happened, we often see that white, like working class or lower income white neighborhoods are often the first to be gentrified. So it is not identical with racial displacement. Um, so Brightmoor is this very unique case study. It's not like, it's not a downtown neighborhood. It doesn't have the sort of density that we've seen in a lot of other gentrifying neighborhoods. But by being so different and unique, it also offers us unique lessons on gentrification and what it is and what it's not. The newcomers in Brightmoor, had a lot in common with the sort of first wave of gentrifiers that we've seen in other places. For one, they did not move to Brightmoor for the neighborhood that it currently was, but they moved in for what they saw as its potential. So they thought that by moving in, they could kind of shape the neighborhood in their image and what they thought it could be like, right? Which is very similar to kind of how gentrifiers often move into a neighborhood like that. By sort of thinking that by moving in, they could change it into kind of the kind of neighborhood that they would actually want to live. A lot of both newcomers, but also long-timers, kind of expected change to happen too because of the influx of white newcomers. So a lot of them were sort of buying land quickly before it was too late. A lot of people feared or expected the influx of more speculators based on the sort of the coming of white newcomers. So that's a kind of behavior that's also, associated with gentrification. One thing that was really different from gentrification as we know it elsewhere is that displacement really mostly preceded the white newcomers and became kind of a condition for them moving in, right? So decline and both the subprime mortgage crisis and the tax foreclosure crisis meant that a lot of Detroiters lost their homes. And the white newcomers kind of came in at a time where a lot of lost homes were for sale starting at $500. So displacement mostly preceded gentrification rather than being caused by gentrification itself. And then, as I said before, um, the newcomers didn't move in because the great public transit or proximity to downtown or because of, even basic neighborhood amenities. Um, but instead, sort of the desolation left behind by urban decline, and especially the greenery of it, became its own sort of surprising neighborhood amenity for these newcomers. So, as I show in the book, however, even though the sort of early wave of newcomers moved in, later waves of newcomers never followed, right? It sort of stayed more or less with, the early group of people that I'd come to know in the neighborhood. Like I came back in 2023, and my book conclusion is written based on 2023. The city never bought into the idea of kind of a urban farming in Brightmoor, so never supported this idea. And also, no kind of billionaire investor or industry kind of followed, right? So we didn't see this top-down investment following. So Brightmoor really shows that gentrification can fail. Like, every other previous portrayal of gentrification is sort of written after the fact. And it seems as if once the first white newcomer with a yoga mat moves in, it's all but inevitable that the Whole Foods will follow, right? Or that, gentrification will follow. But Brightmoor shows that that's not the case, right? It doesn't even make sense for a concept of change. Nothing in life is inevitable. So neither is gentrification. So gentrification did not overcome extreme depopulation and decline in Brightmoor. So that's the argument of the book. But the book is really driven by ethnographic stories and vignettes and the voices of residents, and it is pretty challenging to capture that in the short time that I have. But I did want to share some stories from one chapter of the book to just kind of give you an idea of what the book is like. Um, and this is the chapter that is all about how longtimers and newcomers differently related to urban greenery that had emerged in after decline. So how did people relate to vacant lots, right? Empty lots and the greenery that had emerged. So nature was definitely lush in Brightmoor. Like for an urban neighborhood, this was a neighborhood that had more grass than homes left, and you know grass grew as tall as 3 feet tall in the summer, specifically also because the city owned a lot of these vacant lots, and they often fell behind in actually mowing it. So in the summertime, grass grew lush and actually softened the urban grid, right? So we had kind of soft streets rather than the sort of straight city blocks that you may think of. Sidewalks were disappearing under tall grass. City alleys that used to exist were all but gone. I didn't even realize until about a year living into the neighborhood that at one point there had been city alleys. And new inhabitants had also come with the sort of return of nature to Brightmoor, including Deer became very common. I was actually in Detroit last weekend and we saw a bunch of deer again. So there are definitely a lot of deer still around. But then also any animals ranging from praying mantis to bees and turkey vultures, like we're all, returning to these neighborhoods that had become so depopulated. But residents looked at, this returning nature very differently based on, their positions and kind of their histories in the neighborhood. So I will first uh, talk about the white newcomers and how they saw this returning nature. And I also call this seeing the bucolic in blight in my book, right? Seeing the sort of country, like ruralizing influence in, what others have coded as blight. So, I spoke to a lot of, when I spoke to a lot of white newcomers, I would always ask them, why, how did you even find Brightmoor? How did you end up in Brightmoor? Because many of them were actually not from Michigan, but they had moved to Brightmoor from all over the United States. So the answer that many of them gave was that they Googled, places to live in the United States. They kind of Googled urban farming. They'd heard about Detroit in the news, and when they started Googling, they came across the website of the community organization in Brightmoor. I spoke to Peter and Lucy, who were like a couple in their mid-20s, who had who had kind of traveled across the United States in the previous few years. And right before they moved to Detroit, they'd lived in a trailer on renting a driveway in Portland. But they really wanted to find a place where they could kind of buy some land and do some more farming. So Peter joked to me when I asked him, he said, well, I Googled the best place in the United States and that's how I found Brightmoor, which is kind of a joke, but also not really a joke because I spoke to Lucy, his girlfriend, in more depth about this. And, they had turned to Google and one way that they evaluated Brightmoor was by kind of looking at the street view of the neighborhood and the all the green space that was shown there. She said Google Maps showed some bike lanes. It showed the Eliza Howell, the big park in the neighborhood, and this really convinced them that this was the right place for them, right? So rather than holes in the built environment, they saw this kind of green potential in Brightmoor. you know, I wanted to understand better, like kind of this way of seeing of the white newcomers. So one way I started to get into that more was by driving around, asking people to give me tours of the neighborhood as if they would show it to someone who'd never been to Detroit, right? Sort of giving me a tour of a neighborhood that I was living in, actually. So one of the people I did this with was Alex, who was 35, and he was living with his partner in a house that they were fixing up, and they actually lived without like hot water or a hot water heater for over a year. So they said it was a revelation once they could do dishes again with hot water, and this was very common for newcomers to sort of live in these houses as they were really fixing them up from scratch. So as we drove into Brightmoor together, he first turned into Eliza Howell Park to show me what he called sort of the majestic maple trees there. And he said he really loved the park, and it was like a big part of his experience in Brightmoor. And every spring, the urban farmers would hang these blue plastic bags from the trees in order to tap the syrup, and they would cook the syrup up in the backyard of one of the urban farmers to make maple syrup, something that they also called Brightmoor Gold, right? So as we continue driving together, we kind of zigzagged through the neighborhood, and he started showing me kind of different farms of friends that he had in the neighborhood. Sort of this was his experience of Brightmoor was very much structured by, uh, places where he would go and where he would know people, right? So he showed me different farms, as well as some lots where, urban farmers were growing the grass tall on purpose in order to grow wildflowers and to provide a habitat for the bees, right? So tall grass was like part of the beauty of Brightmoor for them. As we kept driving in the neighborhood, we ended up at this is around Outer Drive and Eaton. This is a place that some residents would also call no man's land. Because of heavy demolition activity here, on average, only 2 to 3 homes remains per urban block, right? So extremely depopulated, and it become very wide, and you could see pretty far away. So Alex said, "This is the country over here." He said, "They demolished so much that there's blocks here without any homes left. You can see 4 or 5 blocks away." And he passed his car on the top of a hill and said, "It is beautiful," right? So for the urban farmers, there was a beauty to be found in what others have sort of seen as blight. Um, they foregrounded sort of the rural qualities of this de-urbanized neighborhood, and a lot of these newcomers did not know the history. They had not lived through the history, so they did not remember houses being on these fields. Their tours highlighted few remains of urbanism or even things that we associate with urban identities, um, but including it also de-emphasized the urban lives that people were still living among these fields, right? It didn't highlight in tours. They didn't show me Gompert's public school, for example. That was still a community hub. The Coney Islands and stores that were still there. The homes of people among these fields who were still trying to make urban lives among these fields and hoping for a return to density. So they moved both Brightmoor's urban past and its present to the background by doing this. So longtime Detroiters had a very different way of viewing the neighborhood, and a lot of the way that they saw fields, for example, or vacant lots, was shaped by urban loss and their memories of decline. So I did the same. So I would drive around with different long-timers and ask me to kind of show them the neighborhood as they would to an outsider. So as I drove around with long-timers, several showed me, the place where they used to grow up. They would, the place where their home used to be, which now had become a field. So oftentimes they could only recognize the specific field where their house used to be by a tree that still stood in the landscape. So they would remember, oh, as a child I used to play, in this tree. But other than that, it was almost unrecognizable. However, the memory for them lived on, even though there's no memorials to depopulation. Um, so they didn't just sort of highlight, places that they had lost and the sort of history of loss of the depopulation, but oftentimes also the violence that had accompanied urban decline loomed large in their memories and what they saw when they looked at fields. So I drove around with Javon, who was a Black longtimer who was born and raised in the neighborhood. He was 32. And when I drove with him from Venkel, which is the main commercial avenue in Brightmoor, to his house, which was around 7 blocks, um, he pointed out different places that were very different than what Alex showed me, right? So Javon pointed at one field, saying that this was the place where he had been shot himself in his leg. He pointed out another place where someone he knew had died. And then he pointed out a third place, a place where I just saw a field where he had witnessed an assault on a pregnant woman. So the ghost of place still hovered over these fields, right? These were not empty fields for longtime residents. But people, this seems a pretty philosophical kind of way of looking at it, but these have real consequences for how people were acting on Brightmoor and were sort of imagining the future for Brightmoor. They were not just content to look at grass and nature, but they were actually doing something about it. So one activity was mowing the tall grass. This was a very popular activity for Detroiters, very, very common. And after a while, I realized I have to write about this because it kept coming up in my field notes again and again. In blocks that sometimes had multiple burned out or boarded up homes, on the block, residents took a lot of pride into mowing the grass on vacant lots. There are various reasons that they did so, and I talk more about it in my book. But it was a way that they could still exert control over a neighborhood and over a block that's where so many things seemed to be outside of their control or seemed to be, um, you know, um, falling apart. They did so to kind of feel safer on their block, so they had a line of vision, so they could see who was coming or what was coming, in case of dogs, um, and to kind of have a feeling that they were stemming decline. One of the people I spoke to about mowing was Daniel, who's a 47-year-old black resident in Brightmoor. And I actually first met him as he was mowing the block. He had a riding lawnmower, and he would often bring a little cocktail, listen to music while he was mowing the 4 blocks kind of around his house, which had a lot of city-owned lands, which the city didn't really mow, right? Um, he said that, part of the reason that he mowed, it was not just a hobby for him, but it was also because he wanted to come home from work and feel like he lived on a decent block, right? Like that his block looked decent, right? So a lot of mowing was tied up to urban identities too, and ideas of, what the streets would have to look like for to be fitting with your own identity. So tall grass, unlike for the newcomers, was at odds with the sort of urban identities that a lot of long-timers still felt. So finally, it's just an example of like why this really mattered is that, the visions for the future of Brightmoor even shaped, the type of development welcomed or blocked in the neighborhood. So Hubert School had been a school that had sat vacant for over a decade, like many schools in Brightmoor, and it was in the middle of a bunch of residential blocks. And there was no real future for this school. It'd been burned down multiple times, and it's just been sitting vacant. But one day, a company showed up to a community meeting saying that they were interested in converting the school to sort of a light manufacturing plant where they would make wooden beehives, which you may think is great for the urban farmers, but the urban farmers were very much opposed to this redevelopment of their rural neighborhood, basically. They showed up en masse to community meetings to block the reuse of this school. And when Dirk, who was a white long timer who had actually gone to the school when he was a kid, asked one of the white newcomers in a meeting, you know, what if it was a school again? Would you be in favor of that? She answered no, like I wouldn't want a school either, right? Like they had come to Brightmoor for its vacancy and for the greenery, for the deer. A denser neighborhood was not, part of that, right? So these ideas about the future of Brightmoor became very real as residents sort of fought for their vision or blocked redevelopment in this case. And the Beehive Company ended up ended up passing on Brightmoor and sort of opened a factory instead somewhere in northern Michigan. All right. So yeah, I hope that this gave you a little bit of a sense of the book. In my book, I really hope to go beyond these sort of simplistic representations of Detroit to give people really a sense of, one neighborhood, kind of an in-depth look at everyday life in Brightmoor, and offer a more complicated kind of point of view there. Uh, two takeaways. We should talk more about depopulation. We're not talking enough about it. The depopulated city remains widespread. It's not just unique to Detroit. And then second, gentrification is not this inevitable thing that happens once the first newcomers set foot into a neighborhood, but in fact, it can fail. So I'll leave it at that, and looking forward to the discussion and looking forward to Professor Griffin's comments too. Oh, David, I think you have no sounds.
Zoom thing's new to me. I was going to say thank you, and the richness of the ethnography in the book, the stories that you tell, and I really love your vignette about that you wind up noticing lots of people doing lawn mowing and writing. As I said in my introduction, we're really fortunate have Tony Griffin with us. And Tony, if you can join us, I'd be interested both in your reflections as someone who knows Detroit and has worked in a lot of cities that have some of the characteristics that Sharon's been talking about, and both what struck you and what are some of the questions that it leaves you with. So thank you for joining us, Tony. Tony, I'm not hearing you. Is anybody?
Can you not hear me?
Now we got you.
Yeah.
Okay. I was saying thank you for having me, and thank you for your remarks, Sharon. As someone who has spent a lot of time in Detroit between 2009 and 2013, when we released Detroit Future City, I have a table in front of me of a number of different remarks that are complex and conflicting that we might not have a lot of time for. So I'm going to try to tee up some things that might invite some conversation in our remaining time. I think, as I just said, I was asked to come in and lead an effort called Detroit Future City at a time coming out of the Great Recession, the automobile almost collapse, but on the heels of almost a half of a century of decline. Detroit had been losing its population since its peak in the 1950s. So this is a sustained period of loss that we're talking about that contributes to neighborhoods like Brightmoor, of which there are several throughout the city. It's a city of significant size, 139 square miles. You can fit Boston, Manhattan, and San Francisco in its footprint. So the scale of it is quite enormous. And it's a city that is 40% of its original size in terms of population. So the imperatives that came out of Detroit Future City were to try to find ways to advance sustainable residential densities, recognizing that many communities would never return in the next 50 years to the densities that maybe they once had, but that every neighborhood should have some type of investment and a livable approach to sustainable lifestyles, that we did have to think about innovative and productive ways to manage and transform vacancy for long-term sustainability, that realigning city systems and services that would encourage more thriving in communities was important, and this required a strategic approach to land use, and that ultimately this was about improving residents, providing residents with meaningful ways to make change in their own communities. So I think one thing that strikes me about the talk and as it's become my access to the book, and it's also this question around is there's clearly a set of tensions existing, right? And there's clearly very different viewpoints of the neighborhood. I remember my first visit to Brightmoor when we were doing this work and touring around with members of the Brightmoor Community Development Corporation. And their stories to us were really about the culture of the present. So you gave us two stories around memories of place for sure, and future propositions by the white farmers. And you did start to tell us some about the current conditions. We heard stories about renters who, because they could find no other place to live, were moving into this community. But those renters turned over so much. So they were stories about children who would go to school maybe for a couple months at a time before they had to move because the housing quality was not livable. Children who were living in households that didn't have really present parents, so they wouldn't know to get up and go to school each morning, as well as some of the actual physical violence that was happening in the neighborhood. For people who were living there, their viewpoint of this is very cultural, right? And how daily life has lived. And I think it's interesting that the contrasting viewpoint of that from the external gaze of the neighborhood is very physical, looking top down at something that looks green and bucolic versus the way it is to someone living there, which is rather dystopian. And so I'm much more curious about the actual lived experience of those two populations living in two different worlds and how they coincide or don't. And I think, my bigger question is, what do we learn from this ethnographic work that helps us inform how those of us who are working on the regeneration of communities like this, how to rebuild notions of community different from the rebuilding of neighborhoods. What can we take away, or what more can you tell us about the actual tensions of those two very different perspectives? I think another thing to note is, and I'm glad that you said gentrification failed, because if we look at expanded versions of gentrification, I'm not so sure gentrification was ever the goal of those that were moving there. And there's certainly certain precursors to gentrification that didn't exist, right? And so while you had newcomers come in who likely had more means than those that were there, and the racial demography was different, what we didn't see was a trend where that those moving in created an escalated valuation, which created a gap in the affordability of place. It did not radically transform the physical condition, and we did not see rising rents or property taxes. So that didn't happen as a result of new people moving in. So the precondition for it maybe existed, maybe not. But I also have this question about the motivations of that. And you did speak to that a little bit, but I don't know that that was ever the motivation of their intentions of moving there. So therefore, the precondition that gentrification would occur maybe is not part of the story or something we can take away from it. So again, it kind of brings me back to the two narratives of place, and the intention of what kind of place building is happening, and the relationships between those two. Lastly, though, I would say if this isn't so much about the economic outputs of what gentrification usually yields, it does bring me to things we discuss in a class that I teach here at the GSD called the gentrification debates, where we spend a class talking about who are the gentrifiers and who is gentrified. So if we do stay in that frame for just a minute, one of the things that we read from Japernica Brown Saraceno in her essay, Social Preservationists and the Quest for Authentic Community in the Gentrification Debates, she introduces us to the term the social preservationist as a different type of person from the gentrifier, right? And I'll just read a little bit of that and then maybe stop with a question. So the origins of a social preservation is different from a gentrifier. Is a social preservation is a lifestyle choice and affordable housing, usually for a kind of middle class, someone who has the means to make a choice to decide and live in a neighborhood like this, where they might be able to live anywhere. They have a vision, and this is now metaphoric, but this is how the description is: wilderness and preserved, enjoy, and a recognition for old timer culture. In your narrative, I'm not sure that the recognition of who is there and their real struggles is of interest, of concern, as a motivation for them coming to make Detroit their home versus making a space their home in the way in which they envision, which is not connected to the culture of place. Their attitudes towards newcomers diluting the authenticity of place, in fact, right? It's not necessarily displacing it here, but there's an indifference to it. And I'm very interested in your thoughts about how you saw that. Because if the idea, for example, that neighborhoods like this have a much longer time horizon for new investment of infrastructures that builds more quality and density housing, it means that to recognize this as a place where it is more of a housing and innovative green infrastructural space, there's still the need for a community collective agreement and buy-in to that concept, and how neighbors participate and residents that are old and new participate in that particular vision. So the idea that there are really two visions here is quite striking. So the questions are, if you could just elaborate a little bit more on what I imagine are very specific tensions and indifferences, and how does that get addressed? And do you think that there's anything in what you learned that might be insightful or helpful to those of us who are in the work of making more sustainable neighborhoods and communities for people who don't have choice? Is there anything we can learn from your work?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Like I was like writing down notes. I really appreciate your reflections and kind of really interesting kind of analogies to the social preservationists, for example. In terms of like, gentrification never being the goal, I think it's really important to emphasize that no one wants to be called a gentrifier, right? And a lot of first wave gentrifiers are resentful towards later changes happening, right? So there's like an inherent tension in sort of even being called a gentrifier and like what that means, right? The reality was though that they wanted they had a vision of Brightmoor that was very different from what was there to begin with, but also wasn't inclusive of these realities that you're alluding to, right? Like people not having water, like kids having to go to school but not being able to wash their school uniforms, for example, or people really struggling to keep their house and like falling behind on taxes and losing their house sometimes only to $3,000 in back owed taxes. Like one thing that was really striking to me is that there was kind of philanthropic buy-in to the sort of vision of urban farms in Brightmoor, and the reality, however, is that there was, for example, a greenhouse that was grant funded, like a $30,000 greenhouse that was used by the urban farmers, right, by the white newcomers. But it didn't stop someone just living across the streets from losing her house to for around $3,000 in back owed taxes, right? So the vision of change for Brightmoor was that they were kind of saving land almost and saving houses, but with no regard for community was there, or with no regard of the people that used to be in these houses, right? So you can say, oh, I'm preserving a house, so it's not social preservation, it's not the preservation of community of people, but instead it's a sort of physical preservation of lands and homes, right? So that, I think that was really at the heart of a lot of the conflict, was that they were saving like a home, but not the family that used to live there, right? So their farms may have been thriving and growing, but it didn't like there was no spillover, or very limited spillover, in the realities of poverty that you talk about too. And we may not expect that to happen either, right? Maybe that it's too much to expect from a group of maybe like around 35, 40 families of newcomers moving into a neighborhood that had seen over half a century of decline and disinvestment, right? Like it's not even something to expect. I think in terms of lessons for urban planners, designers, I hope that one takeaway from the book is that we can kind of let go a little bit of gentrification as a solution for everything. I hear so many mayors like wanting gentrification for themselves and thinking that the attracting the creative class is the only way to turn around their city. And I'm hoping that visions can be a little bit more inclusive and would actually pay attention to the housing needs of longtime residents as well, right? So this would include, doing infill, building more homes, thinking about ways to reconcile the vision of greenery, like because it is an amenity, right? It is a positive vision in the end. Reconciling that with the needs of residents and sort of having anti-poverty strategies be coupled of that, because an urban farm in itself is not an anti-poverty strategy. So yeah, that's just my initial reaction there.
Sharon, let me build on that, and Tony, this is, I think, a wonderful set of points. I was struck in your talk. Well, let me back up. In the book, you talk in a couple places about some policy um, things that were done in Detroit around uh, particularly the tax foreclosure, aggressive work on tax foreclosures that probably made things worse. And I think you refer occasionally to some interesting efforts to keep people in their homes. So let me broaden that out and just say either in Broadmoor or Detroit, or more broadly as you've looked around the country, have you seen um, some notable initiatives that focus on how do we help people stay in their houses? I think one of the striking aspects of this story is this is a neighborhood that really was built between what, the 20s and the 50s, pretty modest housing. So time was going to take its toll on a lot of these houses anyway.
Hmm.
And you tell several stories of people who just they're hanging on, and then the roof goes, and the house isn't even worth the cost of replacing the roof. So from a what's the role of the public sector here, both in terms of what it can do to help, and at least what it should, what it should do to at least not make things worse.
Yeah, I mean, since I lived in Detroit, there's been a lot of progress on reforming the tax foreclosure system, partly because of legal challenge, right? The city and the county were sued for what they did, and the sort of over assessment of especially lower valued homes in Brightmoor and the sort of steep fines and fees that they levied on backhoe taxes. Another problem was that in fact a lot of there existed kind of a poverty exemption for lower income homeowners, but the city made it impossible to kind of get that. So a lot of people that would have qualified for like lower taxes, like never got that, right? So there's been a lot of good coalition work on the ground to reform that. So it's very, we're not seeing we're not seeing that sort of endless flow of lost homes entering the market anymore. I mean, another two things I would just say about that, in terms of what the public sector and policy solutions like need, what we need here. First of all, like, we still have too many mortgage deserts across the country, and Detroit is one of them, right? There's kind of a modern day redlining going on where homes that are valued below $150,000 or even lower, like it's really difficult to get a mortgage on those properties, right? So when I, bought my house, like I had to have cash. And when I sold my house, I tried to sell it to someone with a mortgage, but that never, months later, like that never came through, right? The bank wouldn't lend a mortgage like that small. So that makes it really difficult for people to actually buy these homes as homeowners. And we're seeing a lot more investors and rental property, and we're seeing a transition from home ownership to rental property in Detroit, but also in other places. So making small mortgages more available, I think, could give more people a sustainable path into homeownership. Because I met a lot of renters that at the time they were paying $500, $600 a month every month for years. Meanwhile, their neighbor, I bought the house for $7,000, right? If they had gotten a mortgage, they would be able to afford that. But without a mortgage, they weren't able to make that transition. And then the second thing is home repair. I mean, David, you allude to it. I mean, a lot of these homes were built in the 50s. My own house was built in 1946, and they were always kind of cheaply built already. So a lot of people were struggling with home repair and keeping their home in shape. Like there are a lot of issues with flooded basements, roofs that were going. So if we can get more funding towards home repair, not only does that keep people in their home, but it also preserves our housing stock, right? Like we're in most of the country, we do have a housing supply crisis. And a lot of the problem is that we don't just need affordable, but also adequate and safe homes for people to live in. But people, especially when home values were so low, people didn't even have the equity to kind of get a loan or be able to maintain their house. So I think the issue of home repair, and it's not I think there's definitely recognition in Detroit. There's a lot more resources being allocated to that. I think Mary Sheffield, the newly elected mayor, is like really focused on home repair too. So I'm hopeful, but yeah, that's definitely what communities like this need.
If I could just add two
Yeah,
quick
please.
things, because I think maybe we're at time, is solutions have to be from the inside, not the outside, right? And so, when we were doing Detroit Future City, we had this conversation about homesteading and whether to build that in as part of the policy, and actually rejected it, right? Because we
Mhm.
wanted to really think about addressing more holistic needs of what Detroiters needed. So, one perspective of looking at Brightmoor and the fact that there is this vacancy and the blurring of alley lines and property lines in one level suggests that this is a space where we could be more disruptive around the ways in which we produce and site housing in communities, that there could be different typologies of housing, modular, mobile, lower costs to build, that we could be more experimental with building codes and zoning regulations that actually create more affordable homes that can be more sustainable, because so much of that product that was there was really never built to last. And so instead of thinking about it as a bucolic landscape for social preservationists who have the means to sweat equity their way through a property that inherently won't ever elevate to the value of their investments in some ways, we
Mhm.
should be solving for the problem of secure and sustainable housing in places like this, where we can be more innovative around those solutions. The last thing I would say, and this was really important to our work in coordinating with the public agencies who held vacant land, of which there were several in the city, that their transactions should be tied to a shared vision that a community has for itself. And
Mhm.
this kind of brings us back to these two very different perspectives and two very different communities that see this context very differently. So if we want to, where I think it's important that there is a shared vision for, is this the bucolic neighborhood of urban farmers, or is this a long-standing historic neighborhood in the city where they are trying to rebuild community and safe homes for people?
Mhm.
A community needs to come together and have that shared vision so that it can direct public agencies on how to dispose of land for people who are buying into a shared vision for a neighborhood and not two separate ones. And that is a policy directive.
I'm going to ask Sharon just very, very quickly because, as Tony said, we are over time. But you have this epilogue in the book where you go back in 2023. I think you've been back in Detroit very recently. Has anything significantly changed in the 2 years since you made your visit back?
Yeah, well, there's definitely been more demolition, so there's fewer like vacant homes that are there. Um, a few people in the book, I talk in the book about some people struggling to sell, like retired homeowners, like kind of having this really being kind of stuck in place because of this very low home value. A few people sold, so that was kind of exciting to see for them. And the sort of the vision for the future of Brightmoor that I allude to in the conclusion is sort of really moving forward. So I would I would urge people to like reach the conclusion, and that is
Yeah.
happening. So the city is moving forward with its vision for part of Brightmoor. But yes, other than that, it was very much consistent with what I saw the last time I was there. Yeah.
Um, Apologies to all of you. There's a really rich set of questions. We will share these with Sharon and Tony, and they may want to in some cases follow up with you. But it's really testament that Sharon, I think you've in a really rich ethnographic way are directing our attention to something that we haven't paid as much attention to, which is this experience in neighborhoods um, I don't know about the phrase failed gentrification, but really what life is like in these neighborhoods and in this sort of interesting moment of transition. It's a terrific book. There it is. Um, and thank you for really spurring a great discussion here, and I think one that I hope will resonate. Again, the book is just out. You can order it from the University of Chicago Press or whatever local bookstore or bookseller you use. Sharon, Tony, thank you for just a wonderfully thoughtful discussion. Thank you all for joining us, and everybody have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.